Chapter 1. Being a witch wasn't something we talked about with customers. It's been over 400 years since my ancestor Isabella Proctor was convicted of witchcraft, and the fear of being found out still ran deep. That was why, on the surface, the witches in Portsmouth seemed like normal people. Okay, maybe not normal, maybe harmlessly eccentric. Take me, for example. I looked like any other 21-year-old shop girl with 2 jobs trying to make it on her own. I was 5'7" and had black hair, dark blue eyes, and features that to me seemed too large for my face. My best friend Abby said I was glamorous, but I thought I was more of an ugly duckling. Abby has always been the beautiful one, with delicate features, gleaming golden hair, and the kind of grace and physical presence that resulted from over a decade of dance classes. Maybe I wouldn't have stood out in a crowd, but I was one of the few potion witches in New Hampshire. I grasped the ornate brass doorknob and pushed open the door to the Portsmouth apothecary. The shop always smelled like the tea of the day, and today's was rosehip and hibiscus. I closed the door behind me and took a moment to survey the sales floor. The jars of herbs that lined the right-hand side of the shop were running low despite the stock we kept in the prep room. The candle display in the center of the room needed to be refilled, and several of the touristy knickknacks in front of the large picture window had been knocked off the table. I quickly made my way to the office in the back, where I hung up my coat and pulled my hair back into a bun. I loved this store, and using my talents as a potion witch to help people, human and witch, even if the humans didn't realize magic was involved. Once I returned to the main room, I looked to Trina Bassett, my boss. Her lips were pinched in frustration, and her left eye twitched. She was busy helping Mrs. Williams with an order. Mrs. Williams was in her 70s, but dressed and acted at least 2 decades younger. She was extremely particular and would choose each bud of lavender and chamomile for her tea blend. It took ages to complete her order every week. I could tell by the way Trina was holding her short, round body rigid that she was almost at the end of her patience. "Good morning, Isabella," Trina called to me as she pulled a jar of lavender from its spot on the shelf and showed it to Mrs. Williams. I smiled at her, hoping she'd read my encouragement. "Morning, Trina." "Morning, Mrs. Williams." Mrs. Williams pointed a bony finger to several lavender buds, and Trina delicately pulled them out with a pair of tongs. Ordinarily, we use a scoop to remove the herbs from their jars, but not for Mrs. Williams. A half-pound of tea might take an hour to assemble for her. The clouds broke and sun flooded through the front window. The light reflected off the pale yellow walls, bathing the shop in a warm glow. March in New Hampshire was almost always gray, but these moments of sunshine reminded us better weather was coming. A glint of sunlight bouncing off a shard of broken glass near the herb jars caught my eye. I wanted to ask Trina what happened today that the shop was in such disarray, but that would have to wait until Mrs. Williams left. I grabbed the broom and dustpan from the closet by the back door. As I closed the closet door, Mrs. Williams raised her voice. "I don't care what you think, Trina. You know the right thing to do, and I expect you to take care of it by tonight. I won't be held responsible if you don't." Not wanting to intrude, I stood at the checkout counter in the back of the room. Once Mrs. Williams left, I swept the glass up while Trina replaced the flower jars she had been using. "What was that all about?" I asked. "It's nothing to worry about, my dear," she said. Her grimace told me otherwise. I'd been Trina's apprentice for about a year, and she didn't hide her worry nearly as well as she thought she did. I continued sweeping and found more shards of glass and sliced donkey root. I picked the donkey container off the counter to inspect it. It had been replaced by one of the new, wider jars Trina had been slowly changing to. Why had the old jar broken? And more importantly, why hadn't Trina cleaned it up completely? Before I could ask, Trina handed me a glass vial. "Your investiture ceremony is coming up soon, right?" "It's next week. Are you coming?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Trina said. Investiture was the time once every 7 years that a witch chose what she would focus her work and study on. My cousins Thea and Delia and I would choose our first non-beginner focus. I planned to choose potions, and I didn't know what Thea or Delia would choose. "In that case, it's time for a test. I'll finish tidying up. You have half an hour to tell me the 8 components of this potion. I blew hair out of my face and took the vial with me to my small counter in the prep room across from the office. The small room had 2 counters, 2 chairs, and all our extra stock on shelves that lined 3 sides of the room. We kept the lights dim because we stored photosensitive ingredients there. Unlike the sales floor, the prep room smelled green and earthy. I sat in my chair, closed my eyes, and focused my mind. There was a standard method to determine potion ingredients, and as long as I worked through all the steps in the allotted time, I should be able to pass the test. I could cast a spell to determine the ingredients, but Trina was old-fashioned and wanted me to learn the non-magical methods I could use in front of customers. The first 2 tests were simple: smell and sight. I unstoppered the cork and immediately smelled pungent ginger oil. I poured the potion into a bowl and recognized the glimmer of pearl powder. Was this a longevity potion? Before I moved to the next step, Trina opened the door. Your mother called and said she needs you to call her right away. I was concentrating on my test and hadn't heard the phone ring. I rubbed my forehead. Anytime my mother had something she wanted to tell me, it was urgent, at least to her. I didn't want to interrupt my test for something that could wait for another 25 minutes. Did you tell her I was busy? No, I didn't. Call her, and if you need a few more minutes to finish, you can have them. I'll be in the office if you need me. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed. Hi, Mom. I'm in the middle of a test. What's up? Hi, sweetie. I know I said I wouldn't bother you when you moved out. It's been weeks since we've seen you, and we miss you, she said with a shaky voice. I thought over the 6 months since I'd moved out and realized she was right. I'd planned on a slow withdrawal from daily family life when I moved out of the house to make the separation easier on everyone. I was the first person in 2 generations to move to an apartment, and my grandmother, mother, and aunts were all sad about my choice. Sorry about that. It's been incredibly busy, and by the time I remember to call, it's too late at night. I need you to come to dinner tonight. I'm worried about your grandmother. Her health has taken a turn, and we can't figure out what is wrong, she said with more distress in her voice than I'd heard in a long time. My heart sank. Grandma was 77, and although witches can live to twice that age, it wasn't guaranteed. Sure, I can come for dinner, but how can I help? Your grandmother listens to you, and I want you to convince her to see a doctor. Can you ask Trina to come by and have a look at her, too? Grandma was stubbornly independent, thinking she knew enough herbal magic to keep herself alive almost forever. She started listening to my advice only once I'd become Trina's apprentice. I'm not sure she'll listen to me, but I'll give it a try. Good. Dinner is at 6. Don't be late. I hung up and turned to my potion, trying to put my worry about Grandma out of my mind. Is everything okay? Trina asked from the doorway. I looked up at her, willing myself to not cry. Grandma's not well, and my mother and aunts can't figure out what's wrong. They want me to convince her to go see a doctor. Trina shook her head. Your grandmother's never seen a doctor in her life. I doubt she'll start going to one now. Can you come talk to her tonight? I can't. I've got someone coming to the shop after hours. I have another idea. Leave the test vial here and let's head out to the greenhouse. I followed Trina out the back door and pulled my black cardigan tight against the cold March air. The rose and juniper bushes planted next to the greenhouse rustled in the wind. Our feet crunched on the gravel path that was finally devoid of snow. The greenhouse was a small glassed-in building she had built in the shared courtyard behind the apothecary that provided most of the herbs and flowers we needed. The floor-to-ceiling shelves were full of rare and common plants we used in our tinctures, sold as dried goods or ground into powder. I stepped in and took a deep breath. The oxygen-rich air, heady with the scent of early blooming roses and echinacea, cheered me. The bright flowers were a stark contrast to the dirty gray snow piled up along the edges of the courtyard and hinted at the change of season everyone longed for by the end of winter. I'd learned a lot of gardening from my grandfather when I was younger, and I used his lessons to keep the greenhouse plants thriving. Grandpa and I spent our weekends year-round working on the family gardens, food, flower, memorial, and medicinal. If we weren't outside working in them during the warm months, We were by the fireplace in winter, planning changes and additions or starting seeds in early spring. Trina closed the door. It's time for you to start using your powers to assemble potions. You've learned what each of these plants will do. Now, you need to put that information together with what you know about other people to form an effective cure. You've been honing your intuition over the past year, and it's time to use it. I stared at her, mouth open. You want me to guess? She put her hand on my shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze. No, I want you to think about someone you're close to, someone you care about, and then let your instinct guide you. We stood silently for a moment while I thought. Who have you chosen? Grandma, I said. Trina smiled. I thought you'd pick her. Use your intuition and choose tincture, tea, or balm. Tincture, because it will be easier to add to her food, I said. Be wary. Giving any medical assistance to someone without their permission is the first step in harming them and yourself. I know. It went deeper than that. Using magic on non-magical people was almost unilaterally frowned on. Healing potions were one of the very few exceptions, but even then, the person had to know the ingredients they were buying. There was no exception when the person being treated was a witch. Close your eyes and focus on your grandmother. Once you have her in mind, allow your intuition to guide you to the plants she needs. Once you have identified each one, we'll go inside and you will make the tincture. I bit my lip and closed my eyes. Once I had Grandma firmly in mind, the lemon tree, the rosemary bush, and the small juniper bush outside the greenhouse took her place in my vision. I opened my eyes. Lemon, juniper, and rosemary. Trina nodded. Okay then, pick a little of each and meet me inside. When I returned to the prep room, I put the tincture ingredients on my table and looked into the office, where Trina was on her cell phone with her back to me. Her shoulders stiffened. Where do you think I'm going to get that kind of money? A man was yelling on the other end of the line, but I didn't recognize his voice. It could have been anyone, because the phone made his voice sound tinny. I don't care where you get it, or what you need to do to get it. I'm coming today, and you don't want to disappoint me.